The courtroom fell silent. A 12-year-old boy, small, hungry, and desperate, stood before the judge, his voice shaking but firm. "You're punishing a hungry kid instead of the people who let kids go hungry." Gasps filled the room, but before the gavel could strike, the doors burst open. What happened next would shake the entire courtroom to its core. But let's start from the beginning. 12-year-old Tom Harris sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his small hands clenched into fists. His clothes were slightly too big for his thin frame, his dark brown eyes darting anxiously around the massive courtroom. The air was thick with an almost suffocating silence. The walls were lined with polished wood, grand and imposing, designed to make people feel small. And right now, Tom felt exactly that. Small, powerless. Judge Harold Whitmore peered down at him from the bench, his expression carved from stone. The man was known for his merciless sentencing, and today was no exception. He regarded Tom the way someone might look at a stain on their shirt, something unwanted, something to be dealt with and discarded. Tom's crime? Stealing a loaf of bread. But it hadn't been for himself. It had been for his little sister Emma. She had been sick for days, her frail body trembling with fever, her stomach empty. Their mother, exhausted from juggling 2 jobs, had tried to stretch every last penny, but it hadn't been enough. That night, when Emma had cried weakly, barely able to lift her head, Tom couldn't take it anymore. He had snuck out, walked to the small grocery store a few blocks away, and grabbed a single loaf of bread from the shelf. It had been instinct. He hadn't thought about the cameras, the security, or the consequences. He had only thought about Emma. But before he could even make it out of the parking lot, a security guard had grabbed him. The memory burned in his mind, the cold grip on his wrist, the blinding store lights, the manager shaking his head in disgust, the words, "We don't let criminals walk free." And now here he was, standing trial like a real criminal. Judge Whitmore sighed, long and slow, as if this entire situation was beneath him. "Theft is theft," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This court finds the defendant guilty." Tom's heart slammed against his ribs. 6 months in juvenile detention. For bread. His mother choked on a sob, gripping Emma tightly, as if holding her closer could stop this nightmare from unfolding. Emma, too young to fully understand, tugged weakly at their mother's sleeve, whispering, "Where's Tommy going?" Tom felt something inside him snap. This wasn't fair. He hadn't hurt anyone. He hadn't even run. His hands trembled as he gripped the table edge. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom pressing down on him, the weight of his own powerlessness suffocating him. And then he spoke. "This isn't right." His voice was small, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Judge Whitmore barely lifted his gaze. "Excuse me?" Tom swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to shrink into his seat, to disappear, but instead he forced himself to keep going. "I stole because my sister was hungry." His voice wavered but didn't break. "I know stealing is wrong, but leaving her to starve is worse." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the jury shifted uncomfortably. Judge Whitmore's eyes darkened. "The law does not concern itself with excuses, boy." Tom clenched his fists. "But shouldn't it care about what's right?" A sharp intake of breath from the gallery. No one spoke to Judge Whitmore like that. The judge leaned forward, his expression cold and unreadable. "Are you questioning the authority of this court?" Tom's pulse thundered in his ears. He wasn't trying to be disrespectful. He was just desperate. "I'm questioning why a hungry kid is being treated like a criminal while people who let kids go hungry get to walk free." The courtroom froze. His mother gasped. Emma's tiny fingers clung to the fabric of her dress. The bailiff took a step forward. Judge Whitmore's gavel slammed down. "Enough!" The word was sharp, final. Tom flinched but didn't drop his gaze. The judge was angry, not just because Tom had spoken out, but because for the first time in years, someone in this courtroom wasn't afraid of him. "You will sit down and remain silent, or I will hold you in contempt," Whitmore growled. But Tom didn't sit. He stood there, heart pounding, breath shallow, knowing that the next words out of his mouth could make everything worse. But he also knew one thing for sure. If he let this happen, if he let them send him away without a fight, it would mean they had won. And he wasn't ready to let that happen. Judge Whitmore's gavel cracked against the wood, the sound sharp and final, like the slam of a prison door. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The murmurs that had rippled through the crowd moments ago vanished, replaced by an almost palpable tension. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man in a Navy uniform, took another step toward Tom, his expression unreadable. The way his hand hovered near his belt, as if ready to restrain a child, sent a chill through the room. Tom felt his heartbeat hammering in his chest, but he didn't move. He had spent his whole life being told to stay quiet, to keep his head down, to accept things as they were. But today, he had spoken. And now, he wasn't backing down. Judge Whitmore's cold, gray eyes bored into him, as if daring him to say another word. His authority had been challenged, and if there was one thing men like him hated, it was being questioned by someone they considered beneath them. "The law is the law," the judge said, voice taut with barely contained irritation. "You don't get to decide what's fair." Tom's fingers curled into fists at his sides. His pulse roared in his ears. "But isn't that your job?" His voice didn't waver, even as his stomach twisted with nerves. A gasp broke through the crowd. Someone whispered sharply, but Tom couldn't make out the words. The judge's face darkened. "Watch yourself, boy," he warned. "This is not a debate. You are here to accept your punishment." Tom felt his chest tighten. Punishment. As if he had hurt someone. As if he had done something unforgivable. All he had done was take a single loaf of bread. "My sister was starving," Tom said again, his voice stronger this time. "I did what I had to do." Judge Whitmore's jaw twitched. "What you had to do," he repeated, his tone thick with sarcasm. "So now you think you're some kind of hero?" Tom didn't answer right away. He could feel his mother's eyes on him. He could hear Emma sniffle softly into their mother's sleeve. His hands trembled, but he forced them to stay at his sides. "No," he said finally. "I think I'm a brother." A heavy pause. Even the bailiff hesitated. The weight of his words hung between them, filling every inch of the silent courtroom. And then, the tension snapped. Someone in the gallery muttered, "He's right." A woman in the jury fidgeted, her lips pressed into a thin line. A man near the back of the room folded his arms, his brow furrowed. The judge saw it too. His grip on the gavel tightened. This wasn't just about Tom anymore. The boy had done something no one else had dared to do. He had made them think. Whitmore leaned forward, his chair creaking under his weight. "Do you know where thieves belong, boy?" His voice was dangerously low now, his patience razor thin. Tom didn't flinch. "Do you know where hungry kids belong?" Another murmur spread through the room, this time louder. Whitmore's lips pressed into a thin, pale line. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. "You have no right to stand there and tell me how the world works," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You don't understand the law." Tom held his ground. "But I understand hunger." The judge's eyes flashed. "You think you're clever," Whitmore sneered, lifting the gavel again. "But let me remind you, you are a child, and children do not decide what justice is." Tom's chest rose and fell sharply. He could feel the judge trying to crush him under his authority, trying to make him small again. But the thing about being small, people always underestimated you. You're punishing a hungry kid, Tom said slowly, his voice clear, unwavering, instead of the people who let kids go hungry. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Whitmore's knuckles turned white around his gavel. The bailiff took another step forward. For the first time, Tom felt a flicker of fear. Would they really drag him out of here? Would they silence him before he could finish what he started? The judge's expression hardened, his frustration boiling over into something colder. Enough! The gavel slammed down. Emma let out a frightened squeak, burying her face in their mother's shoulder. Tom barely heard her. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. The judge's eyes bore into him. The bailiff stopped just inches away. Tom's chest tightened. Was this it? Had he just made everything worse? And then, the courtroom doors swung open. A voice cut through the silence. Hold it right there. And just like that, everything changed. For a moment, the courtroom stood still. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on everyone in the room like an invisible weight. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out. Then, a chair scraped against the polished floor. An elderly man in the front row slowly rose to his feet. His suit was well worn but neatly pressed, his face lined with age, yet his voice was steady. The boy is right. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, hushed but unmistakable. Heads turned, eyes widened. Someone had broken the silence. Judge Whitmore's expression darkened. His grip on the gavel tightened. Sit down, he ordered, but the old man didn't. You want to talk about the law? The man's voice carried, firm but calm. I fought in 2 wars. I served my country. And I'll tell you something, Your Honor. This? He gestured toward Tom, then toward the trembling woman clutching a sick child in the gallery. This isn't justice. A murmur of agreement swept the crowd. Tom's chest tightened. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone was standing with him. Then, another voice. From the back of the room, a woman in a gray blazer stood up. She held a notepad, her pen poised in midair. Her sharp, observant eyes locked onto Judge Whitmore. I'm a journalist, she announced, her tone edged with something dangerous. And I want to know why we're locking up children for trying to eat. The murmurs grew louder. Whitmore's face paled. For the first time, Tom saw something shift behind the judge's cold, detached exterior. A flicker of unease. This, he hadn't expected. People weren't supposed to question him. They weren't supposed to push back. And yet, one by one, they were. A woman in the jury shifted in her seat, frowning. A man in the gallery muttered, "It's just bread." Another voice, 6 months? That's excessive. The judge's scowl deepened. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. This is irrelevant, he snapped. The sentencing stands. But even as he spoke, his words felt weaker. The tide in the room had turned. And then, the doors burst open. A gust of air rushed in as the heavy wooden doors slammed against the walls. All heads whipped toward the entrance. Tom's pulse spiked. His hands tightened against the edge of the table. In the doorway stood a woman in a navy blue suit, flanked by 2 figures. Her posture was rigid, authoritative. She didn't hesitate. Hold it right there. And just like that, the entire courtroom shifted. A tall woman in a navy blue suit marched into the courtroom with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Every movement radiated confidence. She didn't hesitate, didn't falter. She owned the room the second she entered. Your Honor, I'm attorney Jessica Lane, she announced, her voice crisp, controlled. And I'd like to request an immediate appeal. The courtroom froze. Tom's eyes widened. He had never seen this woman before. He didn't know why she was here. But the way she spoke, with authority, with certainty, like she had already won the fight, made his chest tighten with something he hadn't dared to feel all day. Hope. Judge Whitmore's expression barely changed, but his grip on the gavel tightened. His irritation was clear. He wasn't used to being challenged. "On what grounds?" His voice was low, edged with warning. Jessica didn't blink. She strode forward, her every step deliberate, and threw a thick folder onto the table. The papers inside scattered slightly from the force. "On the grounds that juvenile sentencing for minor theft is excessive," she began, her tone sharp, unwavering, "and that you, Judge Whitmore, have a pattern of targeting underprivileged families with maximum sentences." The words hit the room like a bomb, a sharp intake of breath, a ripple of murmurs. Someone shifted uncomfortably in the jury box. The court reporter, who had been tapping away at her keyboard with disinterest, paused, her fingers hovering above the keys. Tom felt his heart pound against his ribs. This wasn't just about him anymore. Whitmore's jaw clenched. A flicker of something. Anger, or maybe something worse. Fear. Passed over his face. "That is a baseless accusation," he said, voice tight. Too tight. Jessica didn't flinch. "Actually," she said, flipping open the folder, "it's well documented." She slid a few sheets across the table toward the judge's clerk, who hesitated before picking them up. "Here's a list of your rulings from the past 5 years. Over 90% of juveniles you've sentenced to detention come from low-income families. Over 80% had no prior offenses. The majority were given the harshest possible penalty for nonviolent crimes." A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Tom felt lightheaded. Someone was fighting for him. Whitmore's expression remained impassive, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Correlation is not causation," he said smoothly. Jessica's eyes flashed. "Oh, I agree," she said. "Which is why I also have financial records showing direct donations from private prison lobbyists to your campaign fund." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. Someone let out a low whistle. Even the bailiff, who had been standing stiffly near Tom, shifted slightly, as if suddenly unsure where this was going. Whitmore leaned forward. "You are out of line, counselor," he snapped. Jessica tilted her head, unimpressed. "Am I?" She tapped the folder. "Because last I checked, due process allows me to challenge an unfair ruling. And, Your Honor, this?" She gestured toward Tom without looking away. "This ruling is unfair. And now, it's under a microscope." Tom's breath hitched. She wasn't just fighting for him, she was going after Whitmore. For the first time, the judge hesitated. It was barely noticeable. The flicker of his gaze toward the press, toward the jury, toward the people whispering in the gallery. He wasn't worried about justice. He was worried about being exposed. Tom's hands clenched against the table. Judge Whitmore exhaled slowly. He looked at Jessica, then at Tom, then back at the dozens of eyes watching him now, not with respect but with scrutiny. The power in the room was shifting, and Whitmore knew it. Judge Whitmore's face flushed a deep red, the veins in his temple bulging as his grip on the gavel tightened. He had ruled over this courtroom for years, his authority unchallenged, his word final. But now, standing before him was a woman who wasn't afraid, a woman who had just exposed his hypocrisy in front of everyone. "This is outrageous!" he thundered, his voice cracking through the courtroom like a whip. The audience stirred, a nervous energy rippling through the room. Some leaned in, whispering to their neighbors. The jury shifted in their seats, eyes flicking between the judge and Jessica, their unease palpable. Jessica Lane, however, didn't even blink. Instead, she crossed her arms and tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, but deadly. "Is it?" Her voice was calm, controlled, dangerous. "Because I have records of you giving lighter sentences to wealthier families for worse crimes." A ripple of shock and disbelief spread through the crowd. Someone let out a sharp exhale. Another voice. Wait, is that true? Even the jury looked uneasy. A woman in the front row of the jury box frowned, flipping through her notes. A man beside her clenched his jaw, his gaze hardening as he stared at Whitmore. Whitmore's confidence cracked. Tom saw it. It was subtle, a quick flicker of his eyes toward the clerk, toward the bailiff, toward the courtroom full of watching eyes. He had walked into this hearing expecting absolute control. He had expected Tom to be silent. He had expected no resistance. And now, the ground beneath him was crumbling. You're playing a dangerous game, Whitmore warned, his voice lower now, the rage still there, but laced with something colder. A threat. Jessica's lips curled into a chilling smile. So are you. She let the words hang in the air for just a second too long, just long enough for the weight of them to sink in. Then she leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp as steel. But the difference is... Her voice dropped just enough to make everyone lean in, her confidence unwavering. I play by the rules. Another murmur, a shift in power. Tom felt it. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a battleground. And for the first time, Whitmore wasn't winning. The courtroom held its breath. Every eye was locked on Judge Whitmore, waiting, watching, anticipating his next move. The power he once wielded so effortlessly was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. His hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there, a crack in the stone. If he doubled down, he would look even worse. If he backtracked, it would be an admission, not just of this one injustice, but of the many before it. Tom's chest tightened. The silence was suffocating. Then, bang. Whitmore's gavel slammed down. The charges are dropped. A pause. Then, the boy is free to go. Gasps. For a split second, no one moved, as if their brains hadn't quite caught up to what had just happened. Then, all at once, cheers erupted. A murmur at first, then a swell of voices as the tension in the room snapped like a rubber band stretched too tight. Tom barely processed it. It didn't feel real. It was too fast, too sudden. One moment, he had been staring at the edge of something dark and endless, a future behind locked doors, a cell that would swallow him whole. And now, it was over. His mother sprinted forward, nearly tripping over herself in the process. Her arms wrapped around him so tightly it knocked the breath from his lungs. "Oh my God, Tommy!" Her voice cracked, raw with emotion. He felt her body shake against his. Sobs racked her chest, the weight of weeks, months, years of struggle pouring out all at once. Emma's tiny hands gripped his arm. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew enough. She knew she wasn't losing him. She buried her face against his side, her small body trembling. Tom squeezed his eyes shut. His throat burned. He had told himself he wouldn't cry. But the relief hit like a tidal wave. His knees nearly buckled. He had won, not just against the court, but against something bigger, against the world that had always told him kids like him didn't win. But today, he did. Tom had barely taken a step toward his mother when the courtroom doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't another interruption. It was the reckoning. A group of federal agents strode in, their suits crisp, their expressions unreadable. They moved with the kind of confidence that sent a ripple of unease through the room. The chatter died instantly. Even the most skeptical faces turned to watch. The lead agent, a tall man with a badge clipped to his belt, didn't hesitate. His voice rang out, clear and sharp. "Harold Whitmore, you're under investigation for judicial corruption." A collective gasp. The words slammed into the courtroom like a thunderclap. Tom froze. His mother's grip tightened on his arm. Judge Whitmore's face drained of color. The deep red fury that had burned there moments ago vanished, replaced with something else entirely. Something Tom had never seen before. Fear. For years, this man had ruled his courtroom with absolute power. His word had been final, his sentences unchallenged. He had sent people away with a flick of his gavel, their protests meaningless. And now he was the one being sentenced. The silence in the room was deafening. Whitmore's lips parted slightly, but for the first time in his career, no words came out. Tom watched it happen. Watched as the man who had nearly destroyed his life sat there, blinking rapidly, his brain struggling to process the reality that had just crashed down on him. The lead agent didn't wait. "Stand up, Your Honor." A sharp command. No room for argument. The judge's hands, the same ones that had once wielded the gavel like a weapon, trembled as he pushed himself up. The courtroom held its breath. The agent reached into his pocket, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, and, with the kind of calm precision that only made it worse, snapped them around Whitmore's wrists. A sharp, metallic click. A moment that shifted everything. For so long, this judge had been the one passing judgment. Now he was the one being led away. Tom couldn't look away. Neither could the courtroom. Somewhere near the back, a low murmur began. A whisper, a held breath, a ripple of disbelief. Then, a single clap. Then another. And then, the entire room erupted. The tension that had hung over the courtroom for what felt like an eternity shattered. Cheers. Laughter. The very walls of the room seemed to shake with the force of it. Tom barely processed it. All he could do was watch as the once powerful man was led down the aisle, his steps stiff, mechanical, his head held high out of sheer pride, but his face a mask of humiliation. People stood. Some clapped. Others just watched in awe, as if unable to believe it was real. It was real. It was justice. And Tom had witnessed it. The moment Tom stepped outside, a wall of flashing lights and voices crashed into him. Journalists, reporters, photographers, they were everywhere. The courthouse steps, once a path to uncertainty, were now a battlefield of microphones and cameras. Dozens of hands reached out, eager to capture his story, eager to get the first word out of his mouth. "Tom, over here." "Tom, how do you feel right now?" "Tom, do you think the judge got what he deserved?" The noise was overwhelming, pressing against him like a tidal wave he wasn't ready for. His heart pounded as flashes went off in quick succession, blinding bursts of white cutting through the evening sky. He had spent so much of his life being unseen, unheard. Now the world was watching. His mother stood close, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Emma, too small to understand the magnitude of this moment, clung to his side, her fingers twisted into the fabric of his shirt. Tom's pulse roared in his ears. This was too much. Too many voices. Too many eyes. Then a voice broke through the chaos. A reporter, different from the others, crouched down to his level. She didn't shove a microphone in his face. She didn't bombard him with questions about the judge, about the trial, about the scandal. Her voice was softer, steadier. "Tom, what would you say to other kids in your position?" The shouting around them faded. Everything stilled. Tom felt the weight of the question settle on his chest. What would he say? What could he say? He thought about the cold courtroom, about the way Judge Whitmore had looked through him like he was nothing. He thought about the fear, the helplessness, the way it felt to be told he was guilty when he had only tried to help his sister. He thought about the moment he stood up, the moment he refused to be silent, and he thought about the kids still out there, still stuck in a system that saw them as problems instead of people. He swallowed hard. Then, softly, he said, "Justice should be for everyone, not just the rich." A hush fell over the crowd. For a single, powerful moment, no one spoke. Then, the cameras flashed. The shutters clicked like the heartbeat of something bigger than this moment. Bigger than Tom. And somewhere across the country, someone else heard his words and found the courage to fight back too.